This region of the world goes by many different names, but the Middle East or Western Asia are the most common ones that we hear in the English language. Whatever you want to call it, it's an enormous place. When excluding Russia, the Middle East is bigger than the rest of Europe is, and just like Europe, it's an amazingly diverse place. The Middle East isn't just this monolithic thing that a lot of people in the West seem to think it is. It has huge divisions between different religious beliefs, big separations in different ethnic groups, and big divides in languages and dialects. Not to mention the massive difference in the location of strategic resources like oil and gas that make some areas wealthier than others. In many ways, the Middle East is really similar to Europe or any other big global region, but it's very different in at least one critical way that all of us are acutely aware of. For most of our lifetimes, the Middle East has been incredibly unstable and violent. And there's a lot of reasons for that, but part of it has to do with how the Middle East borders are drawn. Here they are normally on a political map of the world, but seeing the borders like this doesn't really help to explain why they're not very good. Here they are placed instead over a religious map, where you can clearly see that in a lot of places they just don't match up very neatly. Places like Lebanon, Syria, Iraq, and Yemen are sharply divided between Sunni Muslim and Shia Muslim majority areas, while Saudi Arabia and Iran, in contrast, are much more solid. Switch the religious map out for an ethnic map, and you can again see that a lot of these same places just don't match up very neatly. In this view, Syria and Iraq remain divided between Arabs and Kurds, along with even more divisions in Turkey, Iran, and Afghanistan. And finally, let's switch out the ethnic map for a linguistic map, and specifically, a map of the various dialects of Arabic. Each of these regions is essentially a separate community inside of the greater Arabic world, and I want to point out a few important things to take away from this map. First of all, the entirety of Egyptian Arabic is fully located within the country of Egypt. This is very similar to Moroccan Arabic being almost entirely located inside of Morocco, and Algerian Arabic being almost entirely located inside of Algeria. The entire linguistic communities in all three of these examples are pretty much all located within the borders of an actual real country, and that's partially why they're all a bit more stable. But in a lot of other places in the Middle East specifically, just like with religion and ethnicity, the political borders of countries rarely line up neatly with the communal linguistic borders. The Iraqi, Levantine, North Mesopotamian, Gulf, and Najidi dialects of Arabic are all spread out across multiple countries, while Iraq, Syria, and Jordan are basically dialect mosaics. So, if most of the political borders inside of the Middle East don't line up with religious, ethnic, or even linguistic realities, then what are they actually there for? And why were they decided upon that way in the first place? The answer is, of course, because they were designed that way on purpose by people from outside of the Middle East in order to maximize the levels of chaos and unrest as much as possible. This is the problem with the Middle East's borders. Allow me to explain from the beginning. Prior to the 20th century, nearly the entirety of what we know today as the Middle East was ruled by the Ottoman Empire for centuries. The oldest border in all of Asia, and naturally the Middle East, dates back to this time period, modern-day Iran's western boundary with Iraq and Turkey. This border was settled upon back in 1639 between the rival Ottoman and Safavid Persian empires as the boundary between their realms. But it wasn't exactly perfect. Mountains are a fairly common and easy way to mark clear divisions between peoples, empires, and countries, and this border generally sticks to that rule until it gets to the province of Khuzestan, inside of modern-day Iran. Geographically, Khuzestan is on an open plain west of the mountains that make up the rest of Iran's western border. Ethnically, the majority of the people who live there are Arabs and not Persians, which was of little concern in the 17th century when it was decided it would belong to Persia by a Turkish and a Persian empire. But it's been a great concern in the 20th and 21st centuries with the rise of Arab nationalism and identity. But even worse, the Turkish and Persian mapmakers could have never predicted the main cause of the future conflicts that placing Khuzestan east of this border would generate. Khuzestan is absolutely loaded with oil. It's so oil-rich in fact that just this single province alone generates 57% of all of Iran's entire oil production, which means that controlling it today is absolutely vital for the Iranian economy to function, despite it being a primarily Arab province. The conquest of Khuzestan and the annexation of the Arabs and the oil located there were the prime reasons why Iraq invaded Iran in the 1980s, and the retention of that oil was the main reason that Iran effectively fought to the death in order to defend it. But Shia Arab Khuzestan being on the Shia Persian side of the border is far from being the most problematic of the Middle East's borders. Later on in the 20th century, the Ottoman Empire made the foolish decision to join the Germans in the First World War, and by 1918 it was obvious that that war was lost. The empire that had once spanned the entire Middle East was collapsing, and the victors were eyeballing all of its land like it was a free-for-all Black Friday sale at Target. Germany, accused of starting the whole war, only lost about 15% of her territory in the peace deal at Versailles. But the Allies initially planned on basically taking over almost 100% of the Ottoman Empire's land. The British were going to take over all of this stuff, the French were going to take over all of this stuff, the Italians were going to get all of this stuff, Armenia and Greece were going to get some token land tossed their way too, an independent state of Kurdistan for the ethnic Kurds was being discussed, Istanbul was going to be ruled by an international government, and whatever was left of Turkey itself was basically just going to be confined to a rump state here. Now obviously, this is a lot, it's extremely harsh, and the Allies overplay their hand a little bit. The treaty that set these borders was signed by Turkey, but never ratified, and when the severe terms became public, the Turks became enraged. The Turkish government literally revoked the citizenships of their representatives who signed the treaty, and then went on to fight a 3-year-long war of independence against the Allies, before finally emerging victorious and in a better position to renegotiate. A new treaty was signed, and this time ratified, that largely established the borders of the modern-day Republic of Turkey. The European powers were pretty much kicked out of Turkey itself, but all of the lands that the Ottomans once controlled outside of modern-day Turkey's borders were pretty much relentlessly pillaged. In a secret treaty signed in 1916 while the war was still going on, the British and the French agreed to divide the Middle East between themselves. The British were to gain Mesopotamia, Palestine, and Transjordan, while the French were going to take over northern Syria and most of the Levant. The boundary between their colonies was drawn here and became known as the Sykes-Picot Line, after the British and French diplomats who signed the terms. This boundary between the old British and French colonies in the Middle East pretty much still remains largely intact today, over 100 years later, as the border between Iraq and Syria, and we all know how problematic that's become in the past decade. The Sykes-Picot Line was simply a device to separate British and French interests in the region, and was never meant to be used as something beneficial to the people who actually lived there. As a consequence, it largely cuts across various communal dialects of Arabic, and has divided linguistic communities between two countries for over 100 years now.
All of these divisions were intentionally established by the British and the French in order to keep the people who lived there divided amongst themselves, so that they couldn't ever unite against their colonizers. The British and French would eventually leave, but the borders they drew that kept communities divided and separated remained. It should come as no surprise then that the Middle East has been particularly volatile in the years since. And this is why the borders in the Middle East are so terrible. They were drawn to be terrible on purpose, and the consequences of those decisions are still seeing colossal ramifications and loss of life today. Recognizing this, some geopolitical theorists have drawn up borders of what a hypothetical redrawing of the Middle East's borders in the future might end up looking like. This map, created by Columbia University, gives us a glimpse into how tensions and unrest in Iraq and Syria might shatter the countries into 4 brand new states that follow the religious, ethnic, and linguistic lines a bit more realistically. In this hypothetical scenario, there would be a Shiite Arab state in the southeast, an Alawite Shiite Arab state in the west along the Mediterranean, a Sunni Arab state in between both of them, and an independent Kurdish state in the north. Only time will tell if the Middle East will ever see a massive political redrawing of the map like this,